good. Welcome, everybody. I'm Justin. It's nice to see so many of you again, either on my screen or in the chat. This session is all about how to sequence things, how to pace things if you're using any of the Our Stories. So Nuestra Historia for Spanish, Notre Histoire for French, Unsere Geschichten for German, or Nostra storia for Italian. Any of those languages, any of the levels, the things that I shared here will apply. I'll give you lots of tips, both on the level of sequencing or planning the year and on the level of sequencing or planning things in a specific unit, and even on within a specific day's lesson. Having said that, I will give you lots of ideas for each of those things. What I can't give you is the exact thing that you should do every minute of your specific class. Not because I wouldn't love to do that, but simply because everyone's situation is different. The length of your class meetings may be different, how often you meet per week, but you should but between the things that I actually say in here and show you in here and the resources that I'll share with you, you should be set up really well to make those kinds of decisions for yourself and your students. And I'll go ahead and say this isn't the way I've planned this out. I don't think it should be a jam-packed, down-to-the-wire session. And so there should be some time for Q&A and things like that as well. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so I can show you what the deal is in each of these Our Story books and how to get the most out of them. Are we seeing a slide that says sequencing and pacing, and then this deeply meaningful and symbolic series of sort of right arrows showing how it's a path through a year, a unit, a lesson? So this applies, again, to any of these books that you see on your screen. I will use examples from, especially from one or two of them that are representative of all the rest. And if it becomes relevant during the Q&A time or something like that, we can address in case there are any little differences that you may have noticed between one level and another level, because or one language and another language, because every once in a while, all the main points I'm going to make are identical. Every once in a while, there exists a certain type of video, for example, in one language, but in another language, that's a different type of resource that it kind of falls into that slot. So again, we'll have time to address any of those things as they come up. The first thing that I want to do for us is I want to demystify the content of any one of these titles. Now, I and my colleagues have, in a way, been doing that all week, right? We've talked about how to work with a story, how to work with cultural content, how to work with assessments. And so we've demystified each of those things individually and given lots of tools for using each of those things individually. But if you're like me, it might still be the case that you log into an Our Story book, a title, and you click on that directory and you see this huge full menu of things, and that can be kind of overwhelming, and it's not necessarily immediately obvious exactly how it's all organized. Raise your hand for me or throw in the chat if you've ever had the experience of opening the directory, which is what we call the menu, in a Voces title and felt a sense of overwhelm. Wow, there's all this stuff. Do I have to do all of it? Do I have to do it in this order? What are the different sections? What do those different section names even mean? Yeah, I see a lot of people who have had that experience. That happens for a good reason, which is that we've jam-packed the Voces titles with lots and lots and lots of good stuff that you can use. But a side effect of that is that there can be kind of an initial overwhelm. And so a big goal of mine during this session is to reduce that overwhelm by giving you kind of a new lens for how the directory at different zoom levels, different expansion levels, how that directory is actually organized, what's kind of the logic of it, that I think will help you, again, both kind of reduce the overwhelm, but also kind of crystallize or help come into focus what's a good way to move through the items in that directory. So here is I have kind of one driving point, one driving image that I want us to keep in mind for the next little while as we look at different views of the directory to see what the deal is, how is it organized, and thus how can I best go through it. And what that image is that at every zoom level of the directory, and what I mean by zoom level, I'll show you concretely on the screen in a moment, but what I mean by zoom level is when you first open the directory, there's not a ton of items showing because you haven't clicked to expand something yet. But then when you click to expand, let's say a unit, then that zooms you one level deeper and opens a bunch of stuff. And then when you click within there on a resource, it may expand again and show you a bunch of stuff. So that's what I mean by different zoom levels. And the image that I'm going to share here applies at every zoom level. Namely, there's always kind of the core piece of content, the marrow of the content. There's always a set of items that you can use to build up to and lead into and prepare for that core content. And then there's always some things after that core content that you can use moving on from the content to review, to consolidate, and to assess.
Justin?
So I want to show you how that's true, again, at every zoom level of the directory. I'll use the French book Notre histoire, Notre histoire 1 as the example, but as I said before, this applies with all of the languages in the Our Story series.
Quick question, Justin.
Oh, please.
Oh,
Go ahead.
maybe never mind. We were trying to figure out where we're supposed to see more on that screen, but I don't think we were.
Oh, not yet.
Okay,
Not yet.
sorry.
No. So thanks for asking. I wanted to show first this kind of, without kind of the clutter of any words, this pattern. And now I'm going to apply it to the directory at multiple zoom levels. But you're right to crave concrete examples, and I'm going to satisfy that craving many times over right now. So when you open, this is like, let's say I logged into Notre histoire 1 and I click this button here to see the directory. That's what this is. This one happens to have some of the items expanded, but if I unexpanded them, it would look like this. And that's what I'm showing here. Okay. Now, when you're at this most zoomed out level, the level that you see when you first open the directory, if you've never clicked on anything before, remember, I've promised there's always going to be this kind of core section or set of sections, things that lead into it and things that lead on from it. So in this most zoomed out level, as you can imagine, it's the units themselves that are that core central content. Then, as you can imagine, it's the introduction to the whole book. And in the case of a level 1, there's also this pre-unit. Those are ways that you can get into, at the beginning of the year, kind of get into the content and lead towards the units themselves. And then at the bottom, do you all see my mouse thing when I'm, okay, great, I'll use that to show stuff. Do you like how it's the Voces colors? It's like filled in with the orange and outlined with the blue. Hopefully that helps. So we have here, these items here represent this first arrow. Then you have the core content. And then after the core content, you have a bunch of other items that you can use either as supplements or that you can move on to, such as if you want to use one of these built-in novels, you can use them as supplements at some time during the year, or you can use them as kind of a capstone thing at the end of the year. And there's also kind of ancillary or ancillary, if you're in England, content that comes afterwards. Now, this is the zoom level where it's like kind of least important to notice this because it's probably already kind of obvious to you that the units of a textbook or the units of a curriculum are kind of where most of the stuff happens. But I wanted to use this to start giving us a feel for this structure of core content, stuff that leads into it, and stuff that leads on from it. Where this is really going to become handy is at the next 2 zoom levels. So let's say that I were to click this unité 1, this unit 1, ma vie à l'école, my life at school. If I click this, you can see this little orange wedge. That means that there's stuff that I can expand here. So if I click this, it's going to take us to the next zoom level. I'm going to show you how this structure applies again and how that can help you in your making sense of things and planning. So here I go, clickety clickety. And now it turns into the directory looking like this, right? You can see Unité 1, ma vie à l'école, Unité 1, ma vie à l'école. Okay, but now I've expanded that, and this is all the stuff that's inside that unit, every single thing that's in that unit. And now, as promised, you again have kind of core content, stuff that leads into it, and supplemental or follow-up stuff. When you're in a unit in Notre histoire, Nuestra historia, any of the Our Story titles, remember the backbone, the main locus of instruction is stories. And so within a unit, it is those stories. You can even see visually, they're kind of in the middle of the menu there, both petite histoire or short stories and longue histoire or long stories. In the Spanish curriculum, the short ones are called historietas and the long ones are called historias. So that's the nomenclature that you'll see there. These stories are the core of where most of the introducing the language, practicing practicing communication will happen in the context of these stories. But as in the previous Zoom level and as in this main scheme that I outlined before, you have preceding this core of the stories, you have a bunch of stuff that can help you and students build up to, lead into, whet your appetite for those stories. And this varies a little bit depending on the level, but there's pretty much always a little can-do pre-assessment that students can do. There's an essential question or more that you can go over with students. There is often a teacher note to kind of preview the unit and a couple other items. There's not always a chanson de l'unité, a song pertaining to the unit, but sometimes there is. There is always an explore le monde francophone. In this case, explore the francophone world and their equivalents in the other languages. And when you expand that, there's content specific to whatever countries are kind of the focus or where the stories are set in that unit. And in French levels 1 and 2, that's always France and 2 other francophone countries. In the Spanish levels 1 and 2, it's always 2 countries where Spanish is a frequently spoken language, including the United States. So you can see how, again, with the stories being the meat, the core, the marrow, all of these things can build you up, set students up for success by activating prior knowledge, by priming the brain, by generating background knowledge or cultural knowledge that will help students make sense of and further enjoy the stories themselves. Then after you've gone through any number of these stories, and don't worry, after I finish showing you kind of this structure, I'll take us over to talk about things like pacing. Do you have to do all of these stories? Do you have to do all the activities? I'll give you really specific guidance on all that. So if you're wondering, okay, but how do I deal with the explore the Francophone world section, or what do I do with the story? Don't worry, I'll get into that a bit later, and there's content about that in other presentations as well. But after you've done as many of the stories as you choose to do, then of course you're expecting the out arrow, the remaining arrow to come up, and it will. Namely, there's all this stuff afterwards that you can use to consolidate, to get another angle on a lot of the same language or the same cultural content, and to assess. The one main point I'll make here is, and I mentioned this over here when I was talking about the most zoomed out version of the directory as well, some of these things, especially what's in the encore, in the Spanish and the other languages, this section is called extra, is you don't necessarily need to wait until you've read all the stories to use that content. You can skip around a bit, and I'll show you that when I talk about unit planning and lesson planning. But this encore section is kind of the nonfiction section. So we have the stories of the fiction section, the encore or extra is the nonfiction section with articles, biographies, videos, interviews, and things like that. And a lot of times teachers will dip into that a bit at a time to interleave that with some of the story activities. That's totally fine. Or you can wait until having done all the fiction that you're going to do, the stories, and then shift back to a nonfiction section. I say shift back because this explore the Francophone world and its equivalents in the other languages is a nonfiction as well. So does this kind of make sense so far as a scheme no matter how much you zoom in, and we're going to do one more level, but no matter how much you zoom in, there's always going to be this kind of core block or core item, then some things that help you build up to it, and some things that move on from it or supplement. We get okay, I see some very helpful. I see fabuleux. I see yes, great. So let's take it then to the deepest zoom level, because that's where, well, put it this way. The next zoom level, that's where kind of most of your instructional time and students' learning time will probably be spent. So if I go one more time, what I'm about to do, when I show this on your screen this is if I've clicked on one of these stories and I chose the second one just for fun, it's called Pauvre Lucie. That will then expand out like this. So you can see the stuff above it is the same as over here. It's just a little bit smaller so I could fit everything. But what I've done to show this left part is I've clicked on Petite Histoire de Pauvre Lucie, Poor Lucie, and that expands all the stuff that's in that section. Now, because you're smart learners who pick up on patterns, you already know that within this short story section, there's going to be a piece of core content, the central thing that everything revolves around. There's going to be stuff that leads up to it and stuff that moves on from it. And whenever you're in one of these story sections, the core content, as you can imagine, is the story itself. You can always see it or find it easily, or more easily than you think, because the title of that page will be the exact same as whatever it says the title of the story is up here. So you can see here that it's all this stuff pertains to the story Pauvre Lucie. You can see here, it'll always be the fifth thing in the French and Spanish curriculum in the early units of the Italian and German as well, is the story itself. So that's the core content, makes sense because that's the story. And then you have, for every one of these short stories, you have the things that build up to it, introduction to the key vocabulary, and I previewed this page a bit in another session. This is where it gives definitions and audio of kind of the core new constructions. It's where it gives tips on doing TPR, total physical response, to introduce that vocab. There are a couple exercises that students can do to introduce the vocab and constructions that are going to be key in the story. Then there's the question personnelle, or in the Spanish, preguntas personales, personal questions, where there's a little survey that pertains to the theme of the story and uses the language of the story. There are a bunch of questions that you can choose from to generate conversation about whatever the topic is, using the key language with students, and so on. So that continues to take students through this progression from individual words and phrases to short interactions. And then there is a story script, and this pertains to a teaching technique or activity called story asking. I won't go into it in detail now. You've heard many times referenced during this summer workshop, the hub, where there are lots of detailed demo videos on how to do story asking, but that's how this relates. Laura, great question. Are the personal questions the same for the entire unit, or are they different for each story? And the answer is both. So there are questions unique to each story. So when you open this question personnelle page, there will be questions that are unique to this exact story and use this exact vocabulary. But at the bottom of that page, there's also kind of a more global personal question survey that stays the same throughout the unit. So especially if you're doing things like star student interviews or student of the day interviews, then you can use that same kind of questionnaire or menu of questions throughout the unit as you maybe talk about different students on different days. But there are always, in this section, there are always also at the top of the page, personal questions that relate specifically to the content of this story. The preguntas personales, the personal questions page, yes, have been updated some this year, which is great. The questions themselves, in my opinion, have become even more interesting. The survey that students can actually click, and it'll generate a graph of students' responses. That section is brand new. But yeah, like Aaron's reiterating in the chat, There's a mix of questions specific to that story, and then a sort of questionnaire or question bank that you can use throughout a unit. Okay, so you already know what to expect, which is after the story itself. Yes, for Unsere Geschichten, there are also questions specific to each story, and also a bank of personal interview questions. Okay, so you know by now in this presentation to expect a series of items that then move on from the story, and Voces delivers. So after the story, in order to help students re-engage with the story and help students more and more independently, or you could put it as more and more demandingly, process and use the language and the ideas from the story. There's always a series of activities, activité, actividades, etc., with a variety of formats. And you may have noticed before or had explained to you before, anytime there's this sort of lightning bolt encased in orange, that means that there are auto-graded objective questions like multiple choice or fill in the blank from a word bank or things like that. Whenever there is this sort of mountain peak, that means that there's a specific can-do statement. In a way, there's can-do statements addressed on all of them. But the items and the menu that have this logo have an actual question written out that students can respond to. Sorry, I began to speak slowly there because I was catching up with the chat at the same time. Yeah, I'll mention ever so briefly. Thanks, Jamie. I forgot that I had skipped right over that. So this section is called Notre histoire or Nostra, historia, Unsere Geschichte, and so on. That's always between the story script and the story itself, is a place where if you as a class or with students have used the story script, that would mean that you've then, as a class, orally generated a story. And so this Notre histoire, our story, in this context, refers to that story that the class created together, and it's an opportunity for students to recreate a written version or an audio recorded version of that story. So this page is always, by default, it's not blank, but the content that would go into it is generated by whatever you and your students do using the story script. And some people do that, some people skip it, it's no problem. Could someone, great question from Nikki about Primaria, which has a slightly different menu. It still follows kind of this pattern, but yeah, some of the menu items are different because it's not as academic, and there are some additional things like coloring pages and different stuff like that. If someone could point some of that out to Nikki, that'd be great. Okay, so we've now done all the Zoom levels, and I hope that this scheme of there's core content, there's stuff leading into it, and stuff leading on from it is helpful to you. We're going to do an ever so quick brain break, and then I'll make some comments about, with all this in mind, pacing and sequencing and whatnot, and give some notes on planning. But I will, for a moment, unshare my screen in order to do this brain break better. Okay, I am thinking of a number between 0 and 100. Please work, pen. Yes, it works. Okay, I'm thinking of a number between 0 and 100. What you want to do is you're going to try and guess the number. As each guess comes in, if the guess is too low, I'll write it in this column. If the guess is too high, I'll write it in this column, and we can gradually get to my number. I love that you're going to say 14 and 13 are too low. 77 is too low. Oh, oops. 77 is too low. 95 is too low. Who's the first person who said 97? I think it was Chris, Shannon. Is Shannon the first person who said 97? Kristen also gave us a 97. Alexandra, I think, was the first person. I don't know if it's Alexandra or Alexandra, first person to say 97. 97 was, in fact, my number. Congratulations. By the way, I've done this many times with groups of teachers and students, and 97 is the highest number that I've ever picked. I picked it because the last time I did this, which was last week, my number was 55, but the first guest that came in was 97. And I thought it'd be so cool if that person had been right. And so I decided to make it 97 this time. So fun little brain break. You could do it super quick, just like I did in English or whatever school shared language there is. You could do it in the target language. You can use key phrases in the target language. Like every time a guest comes in, you can say, I'm sorry, that number is too low. I'm sorry, that number is too high, or whatever phrases you want to use in the target language for some of that kind of high frequency functional vocabulary. If it goes quickly and you want to spend some more time on it, you can do things like have the person who guessed correctly come up and then it's their turn to select a number and so on. All right, back to the action. Okay, here we are. Do we see a page that says planning notes? Okay, so I'm going to, during this portion, the second half of the session, I will give some global comments or recommendations on this page, and I will also swipe over every once in a while to show you how that applies or how you would find the thing that I'm talking about within the actual Voces curriculum or materials. But first, 4 global notes to keep in mind. So having seen both in this session and as I'm sure many of you have poked around the directory in whatever language or languages you teach, keeping those sections in mind, I want to give you some general tips on approaching planning, and then also guide you to some specific resources that you can use for super detailed planning. So the first thing people often wonder, and people often ask me, is there's a lot of stuff in there. Do I have to do it in that order, and do I have to do all of it? And the answer to both those questions is no, to a certain extent. The answer to do I have to do all of it is definitely no, because Voces does have a series and a sequence, and I showed you some of the logic of that, but it intentionally has more stuff than anyone is likely to be able to use in a year. Like each level intentionally has more stuff in order to give you a large menu to choose from, because you and your students might connect differently with different content. You might find that your students always love doing a certain type of section, but another type of section doesn't really do it for them or for you, or they always like stories that are kind of a certain genre, but other ones don't do it as much for them. And so it's intentionally designed that you can skip things with impunity, with a few caveats that I'll give you in a moment after I give some of these kind of overarching points. So yes, it is absolutely okay to skip around, and it is in fact expected that you wouldn't be able to get to every single thing. And to give you a little bit more detail there, some people, depending on how their calendar, the school calendar works, and their bell schedule, and depending on how thoroughly invested or exclusively invested they are in Voces, will do all 6 units. Remember, the 6 units per level, each pertaining to one of the AP sub-themes, although not in a heavy-handed way. Some people only do 5 or even only 4 of those units. So they'll choose the 4 that they think students will connect with the most. And then with the time that they buy by doing only 4 of those, maybe they'll do a favorite unit that they've already had that they made themselves. You know, I don't know if you have units like this. You created a unit one time, you put a lot into it. The students always love that unit. You want to do it. How can it fit in? Well, you don't have to do every single all 6 units to the full. You can work in another unit like that. Some people spend a good chunk of time reading a novel as a class or something like that. That may still work even if you do all 6 units in whatever Our Story title you're using, but you may also buy yourself some time by replacing one of the 6 units with a unit about that novel. Now, even if you do all 6 units, you can buy yourself a lot of time by not doing every single thing in those units. And again, I'll comment in a moment on how to decide whether something's skippable, or rather how to decide how skippable a specific thing there is. But short answer, yes, it's okay to skip around. How would you decide what kinds of things to do when you're skipping around? Well, I kind of hinted at this already. If you find students always love a certain topic, love a certain way of interacting with stories, love a certain one of the supplemental video series that's in levels 1 and 2 especially, then make sure that you always get to those, because give the people what they want. It's all educational. It's all helping their proficiency develop. So feel free to play to students' interests. And other side of the same coin, play to your own strengths. So for example, if your bread and butter is chatting with students, i.e. using personal questions to engage students in the language and in topics, and you don't really enjoy that much, or you feel like you haven't yet developed the skills to do the story asking, that the story is involved in the story script page, you don't have to do that. Focus on just that real life chatting with students and then move on to some of the stories. That's kind of what I mean by that: play to students' interests and play to your own strengths. And again, I'll dive back into the directory in a bit to make all this, to apply these points a bit more concretely, as in how could this look in practice for you. And last but not least here, however you plan your first year or your first unit or your first lesson, that doesn't have to be how they all go. So try going through a unit in a certain manner one time, and then maybe try to do the next unit, maybe do not quite as many of the stories and more of the nonfiction stuff, the articles and biographies. Get a sense for which of those work especially well for you and your students. And in some cases, you might decide based on the literal content in that given unit. If you skim for yourself the stories, the articles, biographies, interviews, and you decide, oh, I bet my students will love, these 3 stories, so I'm going to for sure do those. I'm going to save this story to use as an assessment. The articles, I don't know, but I'll bet they'll really enjoy this biography of so-and-so. So that's a process that I would go through in the planning. And again, in a moment, I will shift back over to the directory within a title for us to talk through that in a bit more detail. But before that, I want to provide you with an image. I mentioned beforehand the image of Voces title as a menu. So everything in the directory, it's not just a menu in the website sense, but there's an analogy to kind of a multi-course meal where you don't have to eat every single possible thing, but for your fancy multi-course meal, you probably want to pick some or a few things appetizer wise, a certain combination of items for kind of your main course, something for the dessert afterwards, and so on. And as I was thinking through that menu concept, I thought, okay, that's not so much like ordering off a menu. It's more like an all-you-care-to-eat buffet, where you can go up and you can grab a couple little things from the kind of appetizer or starter section, right? That would correspond to that first down arrow that I had of the items leading in. Then you'll probably sample the things that look good from kind of the entree area of the buffet. That would be, okay, which stories am I going to use out of the 5 to 8 stories that are in every unit? Which ones am I going to focus on? And then within those story sections, which activities am I going to use? And then after doing as much main course stuff, those stories as you want, then you have sort of dessert, coffee, etc., in the form of the extra nonfiction resources, some of the video series, and of course the assessments. That's when you write your restaurant review, or when students do, I guess, if we're maintaining that metaphor. So let's go back to one of the directories and see how this might play out. So here we are back in this case, it's Notre histoire. Let me just spread the wealth. Let me switch to, oops, internet's being a little slow. Come on. Come on. Maybe I'll try logging out and back in. There we go. So I'll switch instead to Nuestra Historia 2, just to show that it's similar. This would be, if you're logging in for the very first time, this is what you would see is this sort of textbook cover page. And here, as I've promised, let me minimize everything here. You have this introduction, you have the units themselves, and you have a variety of supplemental or moving on things. Let's choose actually student choice day or teacher choice day, because it will work for everything. Which of these 6 units shall we look at more deeply to talk about the planning? Amistades y conexiones. Great. So unit 2. So if I open that, remember, we know that we're going to see a bunch of historietas and historias largas that constitute that core central content. Then we have before those, we have a can-do pre-assessment, we have essential questions, we have information about Uruguay and Nicaragua. These are all kind of that first down arrow that gets people into the mode and establishes some common information before going to the stories. And then we have, after the last story, we have a chapter in a novel, we have a couple of video series, we have all the items in the extra. This was encore in the French, with these articles, cultural concepts, annotated photos, interviews, and so on. And then we have the assessments. Okay, so that's just kind of refamiliarizing ourselves with that scheme. Now, what I want to point out, and this applies again for all the levels, all the languages, is okay, how do I decide exactly which of these things to do? And if I'm going to skip some stuff, what can I sort of most safely skip? In other words, even if I skip that, students will be okay. And in order to make that decision, what you need to know is that whenever there's a historieta, a short story, petite histoire in the French, Kurzgeschichte in the German, etc. So these historietas, of which there are these 2, and then another 2, number 3 and 4, that is where you will see the new vocab introduced by means of, oops, that's not the one. I'll open one of the short stories. That's where you see the important vocab section, the personal questions, the story script, the opportunity for students to write or tell their story based on the story script. Then remember, you have in the middle the story itself, and then stuff moving on from it, right? So these are where, whenever there's a historieta, these are where new language is being introduced, and students are playing with that new language, students are seeing it in context, and so on. In the historias largas, the long stories, also exist in the other languages, of course. Isn't new language introduced. It consolidates language from the previous stories. It's a new story, but it recycles a lot of that vocab. So what that means is historias largas, you can do them for review, but if you feel like you're going to run short on time or something like that, you can skip those because there isn't new stuff in them, and there's other ways that students will be exposed to the language from the short stories, which is freshly introduced in those short stories. A lot of people, and I think Aaron mentioned this in a conversation about assessment, a lot of people choose one of the historias largas, and they'll save it to use as an assessment. Because if you go to one of the historias largas, it's automatically, at the very least, a reading and or listening assessment in the reading or listening of the story itself, and there's a variety of activities that you can treat as sections on a quiz, for example. If you're going to do that, you're going to follow the instructions to hide this from students if they have their own accounts until you release it as an assessment for them. That's a topic for another workshop. But take-home point from what I just said is the long stories, historias largas, are kind of prime candidate. I love them, but they're prime candidates for skipping if you want to save time, because there isn't new information introduced there. Similarly, even the historietas, the short stories, you can skip if you don't think your students will be interested in that specific one, or there are just a lot of them in that unit. There are always at least 4 stories in a unit, namely at least 3 short stories and at least 1 long story. But often there are more, especially in the earlier levels where the stories are shorter. because we don't want to overload students. So you may have seen in the directory for the first unit in the French curriculum, there are 8 stories, right? If you don't want to do 8, they're very short, but if you don't want to do 8 stories, you can again skip the long ones. And you can sometimes, if you want, you can even skip some of the shorter ones. If you do, then make sure. So let's say I'm thinking about skipping this story, La vida en el mercado. What I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go to Vocabulario Importante page. I'm going to make this bigger. There's this long teacher's note about TPR, so I'll scroll to the actual vocab. What's in this orange box, both for teachers and for students, is the key phrases that are introduced in this story that if students did read that story and did do the activities, they would get a lot of exposure to these. But if I say, look, my students won't connect as much with this story as with others, or I can foresee us running short on time in this unit, what you can do is you can just go check these, in this case, 6 kind of key vocab items, make a note of them. And if it's important to you to have students spend some time with those, you can introduce them in other ways. You can, I'm not saying this is the best option, but you can even just give them these as a vocab list, say, hey, these would have been introduced in the story, but we're going to skip this story. So study these separately, just as a vocab list. Or you can maybe do just some of the personal questions that are on the next page. Right, the preguntas personales. You can do just some of the personal questions using that vocab. So students have spent a bit of time talking about it, but then not bother with the story and all the activities. This personal question asking won't be totally disjointed from everything else because it's still the same unit, same overall topics and things like that. So it can still tie in nicely with other things that you're doing in that unit. Last but not least for now, for this portion of looking at the directory, you can also, here I'll close this part, the extra section is in its very nature already kind of a menu that's not super linear. So skim the articles, look at some of the photos, maybe watch the interview videos, which are very short, they're all less than a minute, and decide which ones you think students would enjoy the most, and use those, don't use the others. So this extra section has tons of stuff that's not designed for you to just go linearly through, read all the articles, read all the cultural notes, and so on. Something I want to show you here that you may, even if you're a longtime user of Voces, you may not have noticed this yet, that can help you. Actually, this is going to pertain even more when I make the final 2 points on this slide, so I'll hold that thought. Want to make some comments on pacing. I already did a little bit, and I'll show you a resource where we've provided a detailed pacing guide for units in each language and level. But I want to make 2 quick comments there. So first of all, when you're thinking about pacing, and again, I already kind of let the cat out of the bag on this, but when you think about pacing, keep these same things in mind, that it's fine to skip around, that it's fine to spend a little more time on a section and less time on another, or skip around, and refer to the pacing guides that I'll show you in a moment. But before I show you the pacing guides, I want to show you one more thing that I thought of in the directory that relates to this mixing it up, experimenting a bit with doing a unit one way once, and then doing another unit a different way, maybe experiment with using lots of content from one unit and then kind of a minimalist approach to another unit. What I want to show you is in all of the levels of all of the languages, if you go into the directory item, the top directory item called Introduction to Nuestra Historia, or Notre histoire, or whatever the language is there, then Recursos para Enseñantes, or whatever resources for teachers is in that language, expand that. There's, near the middle there's a page called Differentiated Instruction. And if you click that page, it takes you, lo and behold, to a page about differentiated instruction that I wrote, that is handy, not just because differentiation is important and I want to give ideas for that, but because I, on this page, outline lots of different ways that you can mix up the way that you use specific types of content that are in each unit of one of the Our Story titles. So I would consult this not just to figure out, okay, how am I going to differentiate for different students, but also just to see, hey, what are some ways that I can work in some variety and sometimes spend more time on a certain section or story and sometimes less. Again, that's in the directory, introduction, resources for teachers, differentiated instruction. So as promised, let me point out some things about pacing guides. That'll be the last thing. And then we can have a couple of minutes for questions. So if no matter what page I'm on in any of the languages, any of the levels, in other words, no matter what page I've selected in the directory here, I can always go to where it says Teachers Panel, hover over that, go down to where it says Resources, which is the bottom item, and at or near the top of the menu that appears, you'll see something called a profile-based pacing guide and something called a detailed Unit 1 pacing guide. I'm going to open the detailed Unit 1 pacing guide here because it shows you, what some of you may be craving of this exact, like, well, what do I do for the first 5 minutes of class on the first day of the first unit and things like that. This is where you get that craving satisfied. So I'll go and click this. It says download, but it will just open in another window. And the first couple pages are some introductory info that's very handy, but I'm going to skip it for now. I'm also going to biggerize this. I think that's the verb. And show you that around page 3 or 4, it starts taking you through an exact unit and with like a day by day, how many minutes to spend on a certain thing, when to move on, what to do when you're on that section, and so on. And actually, because we looked at it more carefully, I'm going to switch at risk of needing to re-log in. Nope, I don't need to. I'm going to switch back to Notre histoire 1 because that's the directory we looked at more carefully. Again, I'm going Teachers Panel, Resources, and near the top, Detailed Unit 1 Pacing Guide. I'll scroll to where the table with these details begins. Just enough to point out to you that, so this, of course, this is based on a 6-week unit. If you picture 6 times 6, that's 36 weeks. Most school years are about 38, but of course, a lot of instruction time falls out. So you mix it up based on how your school calendar works. But this is based on kind of meeting every day, 50 minutes, and you got time to spend 6 weeks. This is kind of optimal or the most that anyone tends to get, right? So you might scale it back a little bit, but that's just for you to have a frame of reference for what this is based on. And you can see that it gives you week 1, day 1, how many minutes, then which section to open in the directory. So Petite Histoire, the first one, Question personnelle, that's telling you over here in the curriculum itself to go Unit 1, Petite Histoire 1, Question personnelle. That's what this refers to, right? Unit 1, Petite Histoire 1, Question personnelle. So this section here, this is always a specific actual page that you can click on in the directory itself. And then it gives you really specific instructions on how to run that portion of the class. And this version here is kind of a maximalist if you're doing most or all of the stuff in the unit. So all the stories, a lot of the stuff in the encore / extra section, and multiple of the assessments that are provided as options. And you can go right through this. This is provided for Unit 1 of every level of every language. Again, the reason why it's not provided for every single unit all the way through is because it wouldn't apply to like most teachers out there and might therefore actually lead to kind of some frustration that it doesn't quite work that way in your exact setting. But this is a really key document. And you might have noticed, you might have been wondering, what's the deal with this back on the Teachers Panel resources? What's this profile-based pacing guide? I recommend checking that out yourself a bit if you want. What this refers to is some people go all in on Voces, and that's like the main thing they're using. Some people have their own curriculum, but they love bringing in stories from Voces and different things like that. And so what this pacing guide does is this is actually kind of to help you plan your entire year based on how thoroughly you plan to use Voces or versus how supplementarily you plan to use it, and will give you a lot of ideas based on that. So I'm going to dip back here to my closing slide to say thank you. This is how you can reach me directly if you wish. Justin SB for Slocum Bailey at vocesdigital.com. And we do have a little time for me to catch up on the chat and see what kinds of questions, maybe Aaron or anyone else who may have been kind of monitoring the chat has an idea of, or a sense of what questions may have come up that I didn't notice in the moment.
I think we answered most of them, but I was wondering if you could just show a PQA page, like a personal questions page, and show how the slides move, because I think sometimes it's not obvious. And so that came up earlier, like, are there
Sure,
slides?
and
And there are.
that has also been updated with this most recent update. So here I am actually on a question personnelle page. To give you context, this is in Unit 1, Petite Histoire 1. And the second thing, the first thing's always important vocabulary. Second one's always personal question, preguntas personales. And what that takes me to in the newest update, let me see if I can make this a bit bigger for us as well. It'll take me to an encuesta survey that if your students have accounts and they answer this, it generates a pie chart with people's answers. I think Erica, who's the main architect of this, also shared this in a recent presentation. What's after that is slides. They're kind of built into the website. So you show them from here. The first slide, I don't think I've ever used as such. It's just a repeat of the vocab that was on the important vocab page, but it's kind of organized there for you to find. And then what it goes through is for each of these phrases, if you click it, it'll take you to questions that pertain to that construction or that piece of vocab. Now, this is projectable. Is there still, here we go, at the top, you have this sort of picture frame outline. If you click that, it will make this full screen. So that if you want to project these questions for students, you can, and it tells you down here kind of on the how many of the slide you are. And people use this, people like to have this visual. I personally, because I find this a bit overwhelming, I personally look through this myself in advance and choose a couple questions that I think are going to be especially interesting or create especially good conversation. So even these slides, I've referred in other contexts during this session to things being kind of a menu. Even these slides, you can view them as a sequence that you ask students, but you can also just use them as a menu where you pick your favorite questions or ask students to choose a question to answer. And I can click here or I can click escape to go back to this view. And what I want to show you here is on each of these pages, there are within yellow here, a lot of teacher notes on kind of how to go about using this page. And there's also a downloadable version. So, and this gives you even more details. If I grab this PDF, this is something you can print out or hold on a device. It shows you here what's on each slide. And it gives you then in red a bunch of tips on how you can use those questions. So it's a true kind of step-by-step, almost like script, especially if you're new to trying to use these thematic questions to generate conversation with your students. It's right there on the same page inside one of the yellow teacher notes for you to grab. You can do the PDF, or if you want to be able to edit it, you can do the doc version. And at the bottom, this is what some of you are referring to in the chat. At the bottom, there's this other set of questions, and this set of questions is the one that's the same throughout the entire unit. So the questions on these slides above are specific to this short story, in whose section we are in the unit right now. The ones at the bottom are the same throughout the unit. And the idea here is, and there are also teacher notes orienting you to how to do this if you like to. A lot of teachers like to have a segment at the beginning of some class periods where there'll be a star of the day or a star of the week and interview them with a couple of questions. They'll often purposely use some of the same questions because the answers will be different for different students. And repeating them in that manner, across multiple days will give students lots of exposure to those. So this you'll always find at the bottom of one of these personal questions pages. I know we're hitting our lunchtime or second coffee time for you on the West Coast, or fourth coffee, not judging. And yes, Paula, exactly. Anything outlined in yellow there means that you'll see it if you log in as a teacher. It does mean that if you're projecting your screen, of course, it will show for students as well. But if students are logged into their own accounts, it's as if that section doesn't exist. And you can actually, won't go into detail on this right now, but you can actually, by using this edit button, you can even change which things are viewed by teacher only or by students in general. Yeah, so I hope this is helpful. Explore the various guides that I kind of directed you to. I'll add some links directly to some of those guide pages for the different languages when this is shared with you all as a PDF to make it even easier for you. Yeah, I hope this both gave you a bit of calm by giving you a deeper sense of how everything's laid out in the directory, and also by reassuring you that you don't have to do everything. In fact, I personally guarantee you won't do everything. It's just not time in 1 year. I don't have a prize for someone who actually does, but it's unheard of to do every single thing. So just like you wouldn't eat every single thing at an all-you-care-to-eat buffet, choose things from each section that work especially well for you and your students, that seem especially tasty, as it were.